It is true that my interest in developing and using this material came because I saw our churches floundering. As Ministerial Director in British Columbia for 13 years, I was constantly being called out to work with the pastor, go alongside and support in trying to deal with conflict. And there were very few resources. But we found a resource through Peacemaker Ministries. It is an interdenominational ministry that was started by Brother Ken Sandy. He is an Orthodox Presbyterian, and he wrote the book entitled The Peacemaker, if you've ever seen it. I call this the gold standard for Christian conflict resolution ministry. I don't know of another book in the circulation that's any better than this. It is so biblical that we don't have to give any excuses for using it, don't have to explain anything away, just take it, read it, and I think you'll find everything to be absolutely solidly grounded in Scripture. He's a member, Ken Sandy, S-A-N-D-E. Not Y, but S-A-N-D-E. Ken is a leader in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. I did not know such a denomination existed. An Orthodox Presbyterian, those two words didn't fit together very well. But it's a very conservative Presbyterian group. In fact, they were using our Adventist church in Billings, Montana when I was serving as an interim pastor there. They were in between buildings. They had sold their building and waiting for the one they had bought to move into. So they used the Adventist church. And as I came in one Sunday to visit them in their worship service, I saw that they had hung a tapestry, a lovely tapestry, over a huge picture of Jesus in the foyer of the Billings Adventist Church, because their denomination does not believe in having any physical representation of any part of the Godhead. So they just kindly covered it up. And that's how conservative they are, which is unique for Presbyterians. When I got acquainted with his material, I said, we need this in our denomination. And he has kindly given us permission to adventize his seminar, which is what you have in your hands. We did not take any of his material out. We didn't need to, because it's so solidly biblical. But we included some things in it from the Spirit of Prophecy. I learned long ago that Adventists are suspicious of anything that's published by somebody other than the Review and Herald and Pacific Press. So I asked permission to publish it with our own material inserted in it, and he kindly gave me that permission. And when he reviewed the document, the draft, before we went to press, his response was interesting. He said, Charlie, with information like you have in here from Ellen White, you folks should have published this material long before I did. I thought that was a very interesting comment, and I think he's right, but we just hadn't put it all together. So I'm glad to use his material. He has become a very good friend, and I appreciate him very much. He has since moved on and created another ministry called Relational Wisdom 360. You can find it on the internet, and the intention of that ministry is to prepare us with help us with relationships to get ahead of conflict, so they won't get engaged in the conflict that we're going to have to address. And that is his current ministry. He's such a creative fellow. I think his creativity was dragging him forward to do something else after he had served successfully leading the Peacemaker Ministries. Take your seminar guide, if you would, and open them to page 4. I want to give you a comment so you'll know how this material is working. There will be slides on the screen. When you see a little icon that looks like a TV or a computer screen to the left of the text, that tells you that that text ought to be on the screen. I have entrusted my wife with the clicker to advance it because I get busy and I forget to advance it. So if it's not there, raise your hand and she'll see that and catch up. If you get lost, take a look at the bottom right-hand corner down there, left, yes, be your right-hand corner down by our logo. There will be a page number, and that corresponds with a page in the seminar guide where we should be. And if that doesn't work, just raise your hand and say, Charlie Brown, where are you? We're going to have an informal time. You're welcome to ask questions anytime, and I'll be happy for anybody else to answer them if they want. And if they don't want to, maybe I can try answer them too. So let's get started with this question. Think of the last time, the most recent time, that you have had to deal with a conflict. Now, it may be that you were involved in conflict with somebody. I'm not going to ask you who you're in conflict with. I'm not going to ask you about the conflict. Just how long ago was it that you had to address a conflict? It may be that you were a third-party peacemaker. It may be that you were one of the parties. Just doesn't matter. Think of how long ago it was. You got one in mind? Now, how many of you are thinking of something that occurred more than a month ago? May I see your hands? Only one person. 2, 3 maybe. How many of you are thinking of something that happened more than 2 weeks ago, between 2 weeks ago and a month ago? One more hand. How many of you are thinking of something that happened within the last couple of days? The majority of hands. It indicates how frequently we have to deal with conflict. It's a part of life. You can't avoid it. And it's not because you've done anything wrong. In fact, some of the time we get engaged in conflict because we did something right. And the other party has taken exception to it. Maybe it made them look bad or whatever. So just because you are involved in conflict does not mean that you have erred. However, most frequently, we have to admit that that's what's caused our conflict when we make a mistake and we have to figure out what we are going to do about it. I need to back up so I can see what's on the screen. So if you don't mind me standing behind the podium, I will do this. I have a suggestion on how you can think of using the seminar in the future, some objectives to go for. If we can advance the slide, Marjorie, I think the next slide is going to tell us about objectives. Yes, here we go. Okay. I heard the pastor say something about, do you wish your special person at work were here so they could learn these things too? The fact is, if we are thinking that this material would be good for someone else, we're going to miss the biggest blessing of the material. We can't do anything about someone else, can we? All we can do by God's grace is to change our view, to respond to our part of the issue. So I suggest we start by finding a few personal areas of growth. Can we advance that? Yes, here we go. We're just making sure that the techniques are going to work right. Finding a few areas of growth for ourselves, then we will be blessed. I'm also going to suggest to Pastor Dan and any other church leaders here that this seminar is a good seminar to use in the ministry of your church, because there are people out there who would like to know this material. And I would suggest that there's probably not anybody else in the Walla Valley that's going to be teaching it. It's a wonderful tool for ministry. And if you get engaged in that and want to talk more about how we can do that, then I'll be happy to give you some ideas on how it can be used. Are you familiar with this passage where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name? What's the rest of it? Somebody want to finish it? Well, let me suggest. Here's the rest of it. Advance. Here's the rest of it. There shall be conflict. Oh, you don't think it says that, huh? No, it doesn't. It doesn't say that. It says, there will I be in the midst of them. I will be there in the midst of them. Let's advance, Marjorie. This part isn't on her seminar guide, so I can't blame her for not catching up. And because there will be conflict, Jesus is going to be in the midst of them. He knew he was going to be needed to minister to them and help them through the situation. So take a look at the top of page 4. The passage of scripture in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 18. Go up one more slide and then I think we're going to be caught up. Yes, here we are. Paul says all of this, now think of this, all of this, he says, is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. What was Paul referring to when he said all of this? What's the this? I'd like to suggest that this is the counsel that he had been giving up to that point in his book of letter to the second letter to the Corinthian church. Because as you look at his epistles, especially in the Corinthian epistles, chapter after chapter after chapter, he's dealing with conflict issues. And then as he comes to chapter 5, he's kind of making a summary statement. All of this is from God. And it's God who gave us this ministry of reconciliation. And I want to contrast that ministry with the concept of spiritual gifts, which we're all familiar with. God has gifted each of us with spiritual gifts. They're not the same. We have different gifts. But as we come together and form church congregations, we pool our gifts, so to speak, and those gifts further the cause of God. That's the way spiritual gifts work. The ministry of reconciliation is not that same way. Notice who the ministry of reconciliation was given to. What is the word? Us. All of us. Every one of us has been given a ministry to use in reconciling people with each other and people with Jesus Christ. Because ultimately, the story of reconciliation is a story of the gospel. People who fall in sin, who need to be restored, relationships with each other and relationships with God. Now, we mentioned that not all conflict is bad. If you look at the first icon there on page 4, Christians involved in destructive conflict lose credibility. As I visit with pastors and other lay leaders, I find over and over again the people are concerned about the young people who have left the church, who are no longer worshiping with us, no longer fellowshipping with us. And as I talk with some of those young people, I hear stories of how, Pastor Brown, we come to church, we hear all of the church leaders talking about peace, love, unity, and harmony. They come to the church and they fight like cats and dogs. I don't need this, so I'm walking. I call it voting with their feet. And they leave. Some never to return again. Fortunately, some to return again. But it's that response to conflict that, in a negative way, will drive individuals away from the church rather than collecting them to the church. Notice the next statement below that. By this will all men know that you are my disciples. How? If we love one another. And I like the way Ellen White comments on it in the next statement below that. It's our unity and our love for one another that are the credentials by which we testify to the world that God has sent his Son to save sinners. That is the gospel at its core, isn't it? That is the gospel. And what is it that's the credentials? Our unity and our love. It's not the Sabbath, as precious as that is. It's not the 2,300 days. It's not the prophecies of Revelation. Although all those are very good and a very fundamental part of our beliefs. It's the unity and love that should be in the church family that's going to win people. How many times have you seen people come into the door of the church through the baptism, become members of the church, and then something happens within the church that discourages them and they leave faster than it took to bring them in because they didn't find the unity and the love that they should have found in the church. It's a sad fact, but it's reality. When I was here in college in Milton Freewater pastoring, I was asked to visit a prisoner in a penitentiary outside of Walla Walla. And in order to get that appointment, I had to show my ministerial credentials. Lauren and Dave, you're retired pastors. Dan, your pastor Jeff is here. How many times have you fellows shown your ministerial credentials any time in your career? Can you think of any? Dan's saying no. Lauren says once. I've shown it twice. Once to get the privilege of performing weddings within a certain county in Idaho, and then to get into the visitation room with the Walla Walla State Pen. So I produce my credential. I go in and I visit with the prisoner. Now, if I was used by God to minister to that prisoner and to encourage him, what was it that encouraged him? What was the factor that made him feel good about my coming? Assuming he did. I hope he did. What was it? The Holy Spirit using me in showing love. Love, right. How about that credential in my wallet? Does that mean anything to him? Not a thing. He didn't even know about it. So it is indeed our love and our unity that is a credential that testifies to people that God has sent His Son into the world to save sinners. Let's take a look at why conflict exists. 3 reasons that are mentioned here. We'll deal with that in just a minute. Let's take a look at these other 2 items before that. What is conflict? Not necessarily bad. It's simply a difference of opinion. Oh, let's see. Marjorie, you're trying to show me that I forgot to read my little poem, aren't you? Back it up. I wrote this when we were serving in Canada, where the winters are long and cold, but you would relate to it here in the Walla Walla Valley just as well. 2 little porcupines on a cold winter night went searching for warmth to end their plight. For hours they had searched till they found each other. Ah, warmth and companionship, almost as good as mother. So down the small hole in anticipation they hurried, nose to nose, then tail to tail. Then anticipation turned to worry. Though they cuddled and snuggled against each other, the best they could do was needle each other. Now, Dave back there is a biology professor. I'm still waiting, Dave, for somebody, a biologist, to tell me, don't you know that little porcupines don't needle each other, Charlie Brown? I don't know if they do or not. That's not the point. I know that people do. Isn't it interesting that God gave us our differences, our personality differences, our gender issues, differences, our age differences, our educational differences, with the intent of coming together to encourage and support each other, and to understand each other. That's why we're different. But then Satan comes in, he gives that knife a twist, and he turns it all upside down, and he uses our differences to create conflict between us. Isn't it ironic? He knows exactly what to do to stir up the trouble. So let's ask the question, first of all, what is conflict? First of all, it's simply a difference of opinion, not necessarily bad. And somehow we lost the feed from the computer. There it is, back again. Some years ago, I was asked to go to a seminar in a church in Hawaii. Strangely enough, Marjorie wanted to go along that time. So we took an extra week, had a holiday on the island of Kauai before we did the seminar. And we had a great time. We could have had a fight every morning deciding on what to do for that day because there was too much to do for the week we had. But we didn't. We allowed the conflict, the tension between all these good things to help us sort out the best, the things we wanted to do the most. And we had a wonderful time. So you see, conflict is not necessarily bad. But point number 2 points out that in a fallen world like we live in, it's inevitable. And we should be expected that we're usually talking about the negative kind of conflict. I like this statement that's below that point. It comes from Larry McSwain in a book he wrote called Conflict Ministry in the Church. Larry's not an Adventist. I don't know what denomination he is, but I think he's got it pegged right when he said, conflict occurs most often in congregations in which there is a deep commitment to the church. Now, is that Adventism or not? To be an Adventist, you have to stand for your convictions before you're ever baptized, and time after you're baptized. So we teach our members to be fiercely independent in their thinking. And then we get them on the church board and we expect them all to agree with each other. It just doesn't happen that way, does it? Anytime you have a group of people that's deeply committed, you're going to have conflicts because those commitments will come in clash with each other. So why? What causes it? Number 1, simple misunderstandings. This seminar is being sponsored by the Family Life Department. I'm not going to forget that, Dan. So let's take the point of a husband and wife with a little spat between them. They're not talking. Something has happened. They each think they know what it is, and they are steamed at the other one. And finally, the time comes when they know we've got to talk this through. So they sit down to talk it over. And they find out that there's no basis for their conflict at all. It's all misunderstanding. And they have a good laugh, and go to bed happy. I want to ask you if you've ever experienced that, because I think most of us have to one degree or another. Simple misunderstandings. Then point number 2, differences in values, goals, gifts, callings, priorities, expectations, interests, or opinions. We see things through our own set of spectacles. In fact, I used to show a little cartoon right here on the screen, and somebody asked me if I had legal permission to use that, and I had to admit that I didn't, and I didn't know how to find it, so I quit showing it. But I'll tell you about it. And you can imagine it in your eye, because it's very simple. An elderly lady is bringing a set of eyeglasses back to the optometrist. And she's handing them to the doctor, and she says, "Doctor, I'm returning these glasses I got for my husband because he's still not seeing things my way." Difference in values, goals. Our spiritual gifts can get us into conflict with each other. One has a gift of service. He's a deacon in the church. He wants to take care of the church. Another one has a gift of evangelism. He wants to use the funds in the church to evangelize the community. And there's only so many dollars to go around. Even our spiritual gifts can get us into conflict. How about number 3? Competition over limited resources. You will notice the passage there beside that is Genesis 13. We're not going to take time to look at very many of these passages because we're all basically familiar with them. We'll look at some of them. This is the story of Abraham and Lot. What was it that caused the tension that divided the families of Abraham and Lot? Arguing over? Right, pasture and water. Too much flock, too many flocks, and not enough pasture and water. Now, we probably don't have that kind of conflict. It's been a while since there's been a range war in the Walla Walla Valley, probably. But we have limited resources. Start us out with a list. What would we list? Limited resources that drive us into conflict. Oh my, how strange to mention that first. Money. Number 2. Time. 3. How about space? How about personnel? All of these things. Every one of us has some resources that are being stretched to the limit. And just a matter of which one at which times that will draw us into conflict with those around us. Now, number 4. Sinful attitudes and desires. We'd rather skip this one. Let's not talk about this one. But we need to. Does somebody have a Bible with them? I have mine here. Do you have one? Would you read James chapter 4 for us? Can you read nice and loud? And while she's looking that up, I'm going to tell you that James is asking a rhetorical question here. And I think, Pastor Dan, are you getting a microphone? All right, I'll talk until he gets a microphone to you. No, we're going to read just the first 3 verses. He's going to bring you a microphone. James is asking a rhetorical question that could be asked about any group of Christians, any church family to be sure. He says, what's causing all of this conflict? Where are these? Here it is on the front seat, Dan, right here. I never noticed it until just now. What's causing all of this conflict? And then he proceeds to answer the question in the vest. So keep that in mind and see if you can see the specific examples that he cites and think of some others to go with it. Go ahead.
Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures.
All right, so let's see which ones he identified there. He was talking about lust. He was talking about covetousness. Was there another one? Let's add to his list other sinful attitudes and desires that human beings struggle with. Who mentioned another one? Position, power, control. Pride. And jealousy. Gossip. Any others? We would rather not talk about these things, wouldn't we? But the reality is that our sinful nature pulls us down into conflict over and over again. I have had an interesting time, Dan, visiting with other denominations, teaching this same seminar guide from their particular viewpoint. And I've been particularly interested in the Lutheran expression because they were the first ones that published their own seminar guide, and when I saw what they had done with it, I asked Ken if we could produce one for Adventists, which you have in your hand. Then the Lutheran expression, I was frankly a little bit surprised that they still practice confessional. Church members will confess to their pastor, and he will absolve them of their sins. We don't practice that because it's not biblical to us. It's not biblical, period, we would say. But one thing I have noticed, folk, that in doing so, they have a freedom of being forgiven that we may not have. We can say we're forgiven, but there's something about that ritual they go through that gives them a freedom in being forgiven. And I could almost covet them in some ways for that. We need to find ways that we can get that in touch with that in reality, to understand how Christ has forgiven us from our sinful deeds and actions. And I have found that it's very difficult for Adventists to say, "Forgive me, I have sinned." Very easy for a Lutheran, but not for an Adventist. We're going to watch a video clip several times, and this first one is one about a mother and daughter dealing with an issue. Her mother has hard feelings because she's been left out of a leadership position in the church, in the women's ministries. And you can see that it has created problems, and her daughter is trying to get her to acknowledge it and deal with it. Let's see how it turns out. I'm going to ask you the question after we've seen this. Where do you see little seeds being planted that are going to germinate into conflict?
Have you talked with Janet?
Oh, of course I have, dear.
Oh, really? Well, what did she say?
She asked me to fix the lasagna.
Mom, that's not what I'm talking about. Have you talked with her about the way that she treated you and how she just booted you out of the women's group?
Oh, she did nothing of the sort. I'm still a part of the women's group. I'm just not in leadership anymore. I enjoy the extra time.
Mom, that's not true. That's just it. You are in leadership. And those women chose you to be a chairperson for a reason. And then Janet Farley comes along and usurps your authority.
Now, that's not entirely true. She didn't usurp. She is just a go-getter, a very energetic person.
Mom, she is using that group as her social kingdom, and you know it. When you were leading the women's ministry, we did meaningful things. And our programs were centered around practical issues like, being a good wife or raising your children or, learning how to love others and helping the disadvantaged. But Janet's just turned that upside down. You need to talk to her.
Honey, things just have a way of working themselves out.
Mom, you need to talk to her.
Well, honey, I wouldn't know what to say. You know I'm not very good at that type of thing. And Janet's doing a fine job.
And that doesn't bother you?
No, of course not.
Okay, what about last week?
Oh, that was just a Freudian slip.
Mom, a Freudian slip is when you're mad at Dad and you mean to say pass the beef, but instead you say pass the beast. That's a Freudian slip. When we were at that stoplight last week and you said, "That Janet Farley has just ruined my whole life. I just wish she would shrivel up and die." Mom, that's not a Freudian slip.
You know what I mean. I was just daydreaming and it sort of slipped out.
And can't you see how that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on inside? You really need to talk to her.
What would I say? I have no idea what to say.
You know what to say.
No, I don't know what to say, and I told you this doesn't bother me.
What doesn't bother you?
None of this
Of
bothers
course
me.
it
You're more
bothers
upset
you.
than anyone.
Mom, what doesn't bother you?
Nothing bothers me.
Well, then what are you going to say?
Nothing. I told you.
Okay, I'm Janet. Pretend that I'm Janet, and you just tell me what you want to say.
Oh, Bria,
tell me
that's
how you're
silly.
feeling. Come on,
Bria,
this is
no,
your
this
chance.
is- stop.
Claire,
This is silly,
Claire,
Bria.
I'm Janet.
Bria,
Tell me.
out of my way.
Tell me, Claire. Tell me how you feel.
This is not funny any
Tell me
longer,
what you're
honey.
thinking. Tell me
Stop
how you
it.
feel.
This is not funny.
Just tell me how
I
you
am not a
feel.
cow. I am not a nobody. You make me feel like some old woman who's lost her balance. All I wanted to do was serve God, and I thought that's what I was doing, but then you come along, and everyone thinks everything you're doing is the most wonderful thing, important, exciting. We could have at least talked. The least you could have done is called me one time to ask for my opinion, but you never called. What was I supposed to do, say no? What was I supposed to be, a wet dish rag to put a damper on everyone else's fun? Old fuddy-duddy. That women's ministry was very important to me, and now you've made me look like some old grandma in the corner talking to myself. I hate you, Janet Farley.
Whoa. That was some Freudian slip. Mom, this is killing you. And maybe not physically, but certainly spiritually. You need to talk to her.
All right. So she obviously needed to talk to her. Why didn't she? What is there that keeps us going on in denial day after day, week after week, rather than sitting down and following the counsel we have in Scripture and going to talk to somebody? Let's have some answers. Why do we not go? Yes.
Because we're afraid of more conflict and rather avoid more conflict.
Because it may stir up more conflict rather than to resolve it. I see some heads nodding up and down. Any other reasons why we may avoid confronting a situation? Yes.
We feel guilty about the way we feel.
Okay, we feel guilty. I shouldn't feel this way. Something's wrong with me if I'm hurt because of this. Could be. What else would cause us not to go and talk to someone? Yes. Feeling inferior towards the other person. It could be. Maybe they're have a longer standing in the church. They've been a Christian longer. Maybe they're more of a leader than we are. Yes?
Last time didn't work, so
Oh.
not sure I'm gonna try it.
The track record of going and talking to somebody may not be that great. So you're afraid to do it again. There are a host of reasons why we don't go and talk to somebody. There is an element of risk involved. There is no guarantee that just because you follow the Scripture principles, it'll automatically work. We're going to talk more about how to go and talk to another person tomorrow afternoon. And we're going to address some of these issues as to why we might not want to go. So let's take a look at the top of page 5. And outline the seminar in 4 simple sections. We call them the 4 G's. The first one is to glorify God. How can I please and honor the Lord in this situation? That's typically not where we want to start when we find that we're in a conflict situation. Typically we want to say, how can I prove that my idea is right? How can I defend myself? But instead, we should be asking, how can I use this situation or approach the situation in a way that bring honor and glory to God? The second G is to get the log out of your eye. That's the most painful part, folks, to admit that we've been part of the problem. It's tough. It hurts. It's embarrassing. But it's the next step in having successful conflict resolution. If we think that in going and talking to the other person, we're going to get them, first of all, to acknowledge their part, we're going to be sadly disappointed. Rarely will that happen. But if we will go and acknowledge our part, even if we think it's an infinitesimal part of our blame, we'll acknowledge that. It's amazing how they will acknowledge their part. The third G, go and show your brother his fault. That's where some of us would like to start. But not a good starting point. Not until after we've identified our part in the conflict. And finally, the sweet part that we'll get to tomorrow afternoon, the last section, or the next to the last section actually, is to go and be reconciled. How can I demonstrate forgiveness that I have experienced from God and extend forgiveness to somebody else? And we're going to talk about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. They're not the same thing. You can forgive, but you may not be reconciled. How does that work? We'll talk about that. So the next little section here is how do we respond to conflict? We are wired individually to respond in two basic ways, one way or the other. And this is explained on the slippery slope of conflict. Marjorie and I spent 13 years in British Columbia. Part of our conference was in the Arctic Circle, and I had the joy of going up there several times a year. And one day in April, I was up there in between Inuvik and Tuktoyaktuk, and I saw an igloo out of the airplane window. We were flying in a small craft, not too far off the ground. It was a late spring, and that is early spring for up there. It was in April. And it had been above freezing in the daytime, so the igloo had started to melt, and now towards sundown, it was turned to ice. And as I looked down, that little igloo had become a solid dome of ice. And every time I see this slippery slope diagram, I think of that igloo, and I picture myself standing where the word slope is on page 3, or 5 it is. How far could I move in any direction without losing traction? Not far. I'd end up in the ground in a heap. This slippery slope diagram indicates that the safest part, the safest ways of responding to conflict is in the upper part of this hemisphere. The extremes on the left are what I call escape responses. We call them peace-faking responses. The ones on the right are called the attack responses. They are peace-breaking responses. So let's take a look at the escape responses first. Denial. Denial can be very subtle, or it can be as bold as a bull-faced lie. You know what? I've discovered Adventists can lie. They can look you straight in the eye and lie like a rug, as we used to say. It's a human trait. But it may be not so brash as that. It may simply be changing the subject when you're not ready to talk about something. If you would give me a chance to talk with your spouse or to your friends or family, I could show you where every single one of us practice denial in some form or another. And denial is often accompanied with the next step, which is flight. We want to change the subject, then we go to the other room to wash dishes or go to the garage to work on the car or whatever, because we don't want to face up to the reality of what we have to deal with if we stay together. Denial and flight. Which leads me to a question. Would flight always be a wrong step to take in conflict? I see some people shaking their heads. No. Would you care to unpack it and explain when it might be a good idea? Sister? You don't want to explain it? No, now I made her worried. She's going to be afraid to shake her head anymore. Okay, why would flight not be a bad thing? Yes?
I was going to say that if you decide that you're not in a mood or in a great frame of mind,
Okay, if you're not in a frame of mind to address it in a positive manner, constructive manner, be better to leave. Okay, that's a good time. Why else? Were you thinking of the same reason? Exact same reason.
say something that is not going to be uplifting.
Sometimes it's not safe to stick around. One of my favorite stories in thinking of this is, imagine if you were, just think about the situation of Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar. And Mrs. Potiphar is wanting to entice him to the bed. And if he would have said, now, Mrs. Potiphar, don't you think we ought to sit down here and talk about this for a little while? Probably the story would have ended differently. There's a time to leave because it's not safe to stick around. If your children are in danger, time to leave. If you're in danger, it's time to leave. But it's on the negative side here because leaving in itself will not resolve the conflict. It may be the right thing to do at that moment, but if the conflict is going to be resolved, you're going to have to come back to it and engage in a positive way later on. That's why it's in the negative side. The ultimate escape response, of course, would be suicide. We're not going to talk about the salvation question about suicide. That's not the point of our discussion. Suicide is always wrong as an escape for conflict because it's terminal. You get another chance. And in a very real way, it's saying, God, I don't believe you're big enough to help me solve this problem, so I'm going to check out of life. So suicide is not a proper response to resolve conflict. There's a memory hook I'm going to attach to these escape responses and the attack responses. I call the escape responses turtle responses. I'm waiting for my little turtle to crawl out onto the screen. There he comes. I am a turtle. I would rather hide from conflict anytime than to deal with it. How many of you can relate to that? You'd rather just pull in your shell, hide in your shell, and when the storm blows over, then you'll come out and see if the sun's shining again. I'll see your hands again. Be proud of it. It's not a problem. Okay. All right, let's go to the other side. The attack responses. Litigation is the first one. We had a neighbor when we lived in Grants Pass that moved into the valley from Southern California. And I was always amused. Anything that went wrong, he was going to sue somebody. He thought litigation was the answer for everything. Have any of you ever been involved personally in a lawsuit as a primary party? Okay. Did you find it satisfying and fulfilling? I haven't found anybody yet that has found it to be satisfying, fulfilling. Oh, it can solve certain issues, but generally not to where you're feeling any degree of fulfillment or certainly not any reconciliation. We're going to talk about times when a Christian may need to use litigation tomorrow afternoon. We don't say in this seminar that litigation is always wrong, but we're counseled strongly against using it unless it just absolutely has to be done. The second part, assault. We usually think of this as being physical. I'm glad we don't have to deal with physical assault as pastors very often. I've had to a few times, and other pastors may have, but that's the exception. What other kinds of assault can we mention? Yes? Mental assault. Yes, absolutely. Mental torment. Character assassination. Yes. Verbal assassination. Emotional assault of various types. Have you ever thought of spiritual assault? It's real. How do you identify spiritual assault? I think one way is that anytime we are wanting to use our influence, our argument, our rationale to kind of coerce somebody else into doing what we want them to do, is spiritual assault. We are bypassing their free will. Even God won't do that. Okay? I remember as a pastor, a deacon told me about his son who was just coming strong into his teenage years, and he came to the breakfast table one Sabbath morning in his dungarees and dirty sweatshirt, and Dad said, "Son, you're not ready to go to Sabbath school. Go get cleaned up." And he mumbled under his breath, "Dad, I'm not going to go to church today." "You're what?" "I'm not going to church today." And that started the argument. "Young man, as long as you're living under my roof, you will go to church, you hear?" And then he backhanded him across the face. He admitted that. He said, "Pastor, I know it was wrong, but I lost my temper." Physical assault. But when I talked to the boy, the slap wasn't that big a deal. He said, "Pastor, it's that Dad wants to make me be an Adventist. I don't know if I want to be an Adventist or not." He needed to make up his own mind. Was Dad wrong in wanting his boy to become a Seventh-day Adventist? We would say no. Was he wrong in the techniques that he was using? Yes, very wrong. Spiritual assault. The ultimate attack response would be murder. Thankfully, we don't have to deal with that very often in the church. Oh, but wait a minute, Dan. Didn't Jesus say something about if you hate your brother, you're already guilty of murder in your heart? Wow. Maybe we're more guilty of this than we like to think and admit. In fact, I was dealing with a church in Alberta where there were two couples who had not been getting along. They hadn't even said Happy Sabbath to each other for many years. The new pastor had no idea what was behind the conflict, so he asked me if I'd go visit with them. And I did. I didn't have time to help them with their issue. I found out that their children, they each had married children, and the two married children couples had joined in business together. And both moms and dads had invested in the business. The business went belly up, and the parents were blaming each other for this financial disaster in their family. And they wouldn't even talk to each other. Attending the same church, wouldn't even say Happy Sabbath. And when I talked to them about it, one lady said, Pastor, I know it's wrong. I know we shouldn't sue our brother and sister. And I thought, well, at least they remember some things. And then she said, so we have Is it a battery problem again? Test. Okay, we'll use this one. All right, okay. So she says, well, we have decided we'll just hate them for the rest of our lives. Might have been better if they would have sued them and got it out of their system. It's a hard choice to make. Maybe we are more guilty than we would like to think. On page 7, there's a little exercise that I'm going to suggest you do at home next Friday evening or sometime. Oh, thank you. Yes, we had the turtle crawl out on the screen. I call these attack responses the skunk responses, because the skunk wants to attack things, address things. So what if it makes us stink? We've got to get this over with. We've got to address it. Let the chips fall where they may. Usually type A personalities. Turtles are usually type B personalities, and we often marry our opposite, don't we? I am married to the most beautiful skunk I know. And I've just been waiting to say that in her presence again because she knows I'm going to say it. But we play off of each other in our marriages. The skunk reminds the turtle, you need to address something. The turtle reminds the skunk, but this is not the way to do it. This is not the time to do it. Certainly not how to do it. So we temper one another. Are either way right? Is either way right? No. In fact, they're both wrong to a certain degree. But we help to bring each other to the central position. Is it working now? We hope so. We hope so. Test. It works. Thank you. Good AV people. What would we do without them? Okay, so being a skunk is not bad. It's just the way we are, the way we've been taught by our parents, the examples we've seen. Being a turtle is not bad. What is right is the Christian responses at the center, at the top. Let's take a look at them. We're going to spend time addressing them for the rest of the seminar, so we're just going to mention them. Number 1 is to overlook. Proverbs 19 and verse 11 says it's a wise man that can overlook an offense. There's not time and energy enough to fight over everything. Some things just aren't worth fighting about. Number 2, we go and talk to the other person, as Jesus said in Matthew 18. We'll be discussing that tomorrow afternoon too. Reconcile just with the other party quickly. And if we can't, then we need to negotiate what it's going to take to reconcile. These 3 steps we can take with nobody else being involved. And if we can't resolve it, then we can get somebody else to help us with assisted peacemaking responses through mediation, through arbitration, and accountability. Ultimately, if we can't make peace, I like to say it in a crass way, because the other party is dumb and because I'm stubborn, we can't get together. We can't solve it. We need help. And a mediation doesn't help. Arbitration doesn't help. There is in every element of society somewhere that will take care of the issue if it has to be settled. In the church, it's the church board or the church in business session. In the community, it's the civil court, the police, the civil system. In the family, it's mom and dad. In the school, it's the principal. See how it works? Every element of society has that ultimate position where accountability will be administered. And I want you to notice that there is an ascendancy of involvement, principle involved here. The earlier that we can resolve the issue, the closer to overlooking it, and the further away from accountability, the final step of accountability, the better we're going to be satisfied with the response, and the more fulfilling it's going to be. When it gets to the final step, it's taken out of our hands, and somebody else is going to make the decision for us. So we're going to talk more about that as we go along. Any questions that you want to ask about that slippery slope diagram? Then let me give you this little acronym on the right and the left that says KYRG, another memory hook. It's simply there to remind us that if we use the escape responses, the peace-faking responses, as our approach, the result is going to be exactly the same as if we use the attack responses. See the KYRG on both sides. So what does it mean? It means this: kiss your relationship goodbye. See why it will do the same thing? So it doesn't matter if you're a skunk or a turtle. If you're using that approach, you're going to be working against relationships. If you use the biblical peacemaking responses in the center, then you're working on building relationships. Okay, let's see, I don't think we better take the time for another video clip just now. Let's comment about the exercise on page 7. There are 10 Bible stories that illustrate conflict in the scripture stories. And I suggest that you sit down with your family for worship, read the stories, and decide whether this was a wise response or a foolish response. The Bible has multiple illustrations of both. And why? Why was it a wise response, or why was it a foolish response? So, anytime you're involved in a conflict, one way to think about it is to replace the word conflict with an opportunity. Opportunity number 1 would be to glorify God. And we can do that by trusting that He will guide us through those things. Look at the biblical statement in 1 Peter chapter 2. It's just above the words key question, right in the center of the page, where Peter says, "Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that He visits us." We can talk later about the leader's example of the leadership giving the example of what to do in conflict. We have the challenge that if we live the way God wants us to live, people will look at us and say, that's the way it ought to be. That's the way people ought to address conflict. So the key question is, how can I honor and glorify God in this situation? How can I please the Lord in this situation? Opportunity number 2 is to serve other people. Now, every one of us has a sphere of influence. You may not think yours is very large, and it may not be that great of a sphere of influence, but you have people around you that are watching you, and they will follow your example of how you deal with things. They will either agree with you and practice the way you do, or else they'll disagree and avoid your example. But you have an opportunity when it comes to conflict to set the example for them to follow. I was teaching a group of leaders from a very large church in a leadership conference weekend. And when we came to this point, a young lady said, can I tell a story about this? I said, sure. So she said, I went through this, attended this church all the way through my young childhood and adulthood, a place called Walla Walla University, and I got a degree, and I came back. And all through these years, I have had a good friend, another girl that have been good friends, and we're both single, and we've had a practice of meeting together on Friday nights to welcome the Sabbath together. It was a good thing for them. Then she said, one week I discovered that my friend had invited or allowed, one or the other, her boyfriend to move in, and they were shacking up. And it really bothered me. And the Lord, I think, told me that I should talk to her about it. I knew her parents wouldn't know about it. They certainly wouldn't approve. Who was going to talk to her if I didn't? So I came to the conclusion that I needed to. And that Friday night when she came over, I broached the subject. And she said, Pastor Brown, it didn't go well at all. She became angry. She called me names that she shouldn't have even had in her vocabulary. And she slammed the door on the way out saying, I never want to see you again. And I was miserable, she said, for a couple of weeks. And I was really questioning whether I had done the right thing. I thought that that's what God would have me to do. Maybe I didn't do it right. I don't know. I was miserable. And then a couple of weeks later, there was a knock on the door. Friday night, she was there. Can I come in? Sure. And she very humbly apologized for her overreaction and her negative reaction. And she said, looking back on it now, I know that you were right and you did the right thing. And I want to thank you for having the guts to talk to me about it, even though I didn't respond well. And I just want you to know that because you had the guts to broach the subject with me, it shook me and I had to think about it. And we've decided he has moved out. We're not going to live together unless we get married. Then we'll join our lives together. Doesn't always end up with that good of an ending, does it? But it does illustrate the point that sometimes in Christian leadership, we have to address things with other people. We have to encourage them to do the right thing. We have to challenge them when we see them doing the wrong thing. We need to serve other people. Opportunity number 3, top of page 9. The opportunity to grow as individuals in Christ. Now, we all know that when we get married, the Lord provides our spouse to hone and polish our character, don't they? And when we get children, they really help us to polish our character. We grow because of the tension in the home, and we're responding to it profitably and positively. James says in chapter 1, consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you face trials of many kinds. Now, I'm sure that when you realize you're in a conflict, you're the kind of person that would say, oh, thank you, God, for this opportunity. Not likely. We see these things best in hindsight rather than present sight. But Ellen White shows us here in this statement from Christ Object Lessons, through conflict, the spiritual life is strengthened. Trials well borne will develop a steadfastness of character and precious spiritual graces. And this perfect fruit of faith, meekness, and love often matures best amid the storm clouds and darkness. So in hindsight, we can see that we grew during a situation. We often call this the ABCs of Christian growth. Adversity builds character. It will either make us or ruin us, depending on how we relate to it. That's opportunity number 3. Now let's take a look at opportunity number 4. We can grow as a body. There is such a thing as corporate growth, because in honoring differences as a source of richness and strength, we can all grow. I believe that God gives different personalities and strengths and characters in a congregation, to help us grow. I remember a church in British Columbia that was pretty well plateaued in its growth. It has a good congregation, not an unhealthy one, but it just hadn't grown for a number of years. And then 2 or 3 Filipino families moved in. And they got busy and they shared their faith. And more Filipinos came because these 3 were there. Pretty soon there was a large group of Filipinos there. And that church just came to life all of a sudden, until one of the church members called me and said, Pastor Brown, help us. These Filipinos are driving us crazy. They want to go to church all day long. They want to have fellowship dinner every Sabbath. They want us to go out and have Bible studies on Sabbath afternoon. And can you help us do something? It was their differences that were needling each other and causing the conflict. So it's these differences of opinion, the methods and purposes, even when they're bringing frustration in the body. But God's plan is that we are to help us to grow by understanding each other. Notice a statement from Ellen White on Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4. Many people may be brought together in a unity of religious faith whose opinions, habits, and taste in temporal matters are not in harmony. She says, but if they have the love of Christ, they may have the sweetest and most intelligent communion together, and a unity most wonderful. I suggest that you folk in the Walla Walla Valley are in a very unique situation for Adventists, because you have multiple churches to choose from when you decide where you want to attend. And I've noticed in this valley and in other places like Portland, where we are living in that area, people gravitate to the church where they're most comfortable, where their friends are, with a style of worship that they like, with whatever. So we kind of sort ourselves out with people that we feel most comfortable with. And that's not bad. But if you were in Cheyenne, Wyoming, like I was just a few weeks ago, working with the church there is only one Seventh-day Adventist church. And they have a wide variety of interest, of ethnic groups, even languages. And they have a hard time getting along with each other. If you're going to go to the Adventist church, there's one choice. Or drive 50 or 60 miles, which most people don't want to do. So we need to allow our differences to help us understand each other and find a richness of quality that we might not have if we didn't have that diversity. Jeff, would you come up here for a minute and help me with an illustration? I'd appreciate it. While he's coming, I want to see if we have a common consent here among us that all of us are sinners that need to be saved by the grace through Christ. Do you agree with that? Oh, even Jeff agrees with that. Right. Okay, so both hands and a foot. Okay, so we're elders in the same church, but we don't see eye to eye on everything. And because I'm new to the faith, I may be doing things that, let's reverse it. Let's say you're new in the faith. You may be doing things that as an old timer, I don't feel comfortable with, okay? So I'm gonna deal with this situation and come to you and talk to you like it says in Matthew 18, verse 15, we're gonna get to that tomorrow afternoon. And I would say, Jeff, look, I'm uncomfortable with the way you sin. So you either stop sinning or else you sin like I do. That's crass, isn't it? We'd never say that to each other, would we? Oh, no. But would we give that message to each other through our innuendos, our little body language or whatever? Thanks, Jeff. You can go back and sit down. I'm totally comfortable with the way you sin, by the way, Jeff. I'm totally comfortable with how you choose to sin. That's your business. I'm being fictitious there, of course. So we would never accuse people of having to live exactly like we do in order to be comfortable with them. We'd never say it, but would we practice it by our little innuendos or words? Unity is not uniformity. There's a distinct difference. Would somebody like to unpack the difference? What's the difference between unity and uniformity? Yes.
Agree on issues that are essential and agree to disagree on things that are not.
Okay, you agree on things that are essential and you're going to disagree on things that are not so essential. I believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is one of the most unified churches in Protestant theology. We have our 28 fundamental beliefs, and that's more than many churches have, and we support them and agree to them, okay? But there's room for disagreement on how we apply them and the details of how we believe in them. Such things as the nature of Christ. If you want to get a good discussion started on Sabbath afternoon, bring that one up and you'll find differences of opinion, for sure. But we can all be Seventh-day Adventists and hold those opinions. Uniformity is not the issue. We don't have to pray alike. We don't have to sing alike. We don't have to worship exactly alike in order to be unified. That's uniformity, not unity. We need to keep that in mind as we think about how we're going to worship and work together. This next section on page 9 is called Stewardship of Conflict. When I reviewed Ken Sande's material, he used an interesting word that I hadn't been using. He called it stewarding conflict. Stewarding conflict. I think we as Adventists have a pretty good concept of stewardship. We understand about stewardship of our time and the Sabbath hours. We have an idea involved in stewardship of our finances, our possessions, our tithing, our offerings, etc., etc. But I doubt that you have likely considered being a good steward of conflict. Probably never entered your mind. Stewarding is a present participle, if I remember my high school English correctly. And a present participle refers to present ongoing action. It fits, doesn't it? Stewarding conflict. Present ongoing action of how we relate to conflict. But I chose not to use it because then I'd have to stop and explain it every time, just like I did now. So we're stewardship of conflict. On page 10, the issue for a Christian is not our rights, but rather it's on what? But rather it's on obedience. Is that it? And make sure that dog is put down. He doesn't deserve to live. That was his opinion. So Willis comes to his pastor, me, and says, Pastor, what do I do? Well, I was wise enough not to answer that question for him. But we talked about various possibilities of what he could do, and he went home to pray about it, decide what to do. That was Thursday. Sabbath morning, Willis was passing the offering plate on his section of the church sanctuary. It was a long, drawn-out sanctuary. And he had a quarter of the church to pass the offering plate to. And as he sent the offering plate down a particular aisle, he thought a couple looked familiar. He couldn't place it. And then it dawned on him. Here were the owners of the dog in church. They were equally as shocked to see him passing the offering plate. How ironic to meet 2 days later in church. Well, before I tell you what he had chosen to do, let me hear your answers. What do you think he should have done? What would you have done? You're all bashful about suggesting what you would do. Anybody want to give it a try? Okay, I'll tell you. He called him up on Friday, and he said, look, I don't know what happened. I apparently got the wrong day because there was no sale in the backyard. The dog was defending his turf. And he said, I'm going to accept some responsibility for that. If you'll be willing to pay for my ER bill, I'll forget the whole thing. What you do with the dog is your choice. Do you think he said the right thing? Think he made the right choice? Would you have said that if I hadn't told you the rest of the story? All right. But for Willis, it was a matter of what is the right thing to do, not to stand up for his rights as an individual and carry it from that point of view. We found out that this was the first Sabbath this couple had ever been in an Adventist church because another couple in the church was studying with them. And they studied about the Sabbath. Wouldn't you know that was the Sabbath they'd come and to meet Willis. So, as stewards, it's our responsibility to do the right thing, to practice obedience to God's plan and let God be responsible for the results. And the final thought is that for us as Christians, peacemaking is not a choice. It's not an option. Paul says in Romans 12, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with how many? Everybody. Now that is a challenge. I find that there are certain people in my life that are very difficult to live at peace with. And I think I'm a pretty easygoing fellow. But there have been a few that I just can't seem to work with. And I'm glad Paul said, if it is possible. And I'm glad he said, as far as it depends on you, do your best. That's what all God expects of you, to live at peace with everybody. And then leave the results to God. And I'm hurrying down to the bottom line here at the page 10. To make every effort to strive earnestly and repeatedly is a scriptural counsel. I have traveled through the years teaching this seminar and working with churches in conflict. And on one particular trip, I was on the East Coast. And my body clock hadn't adjusted, so I'd gone to bed. But it wasn't time to go to sleep yet, according to my body. And I turned on the television, and in scanning the channels, I came across a movie that was showing scenes from the Roman gladiator days. And I thought, what in the world is this? I watched it just long enough to watch these gladiators fight to the death. Of course, it was the Hollywood version. But of course, it reflected the reality of history, though it was a movie. And I remembered that the word that is used in the King James Bible to strive earnestly and repeatedly is the same word that is used to describe the work of a Roman gladiator. And it occurred to me, what if I tried as hard to resolve conflict as these Roman gladiators did to defend their lives? What if my life depended on bringing reconciliation with my brother and sister in Christ? I think I would approach it a little differently than I have at times, don't you? What if our lives depended on it? We would try harder to live in unity and love with one another. Tomorrow afternoon, we're going to take a quick look at the rest of the seminar. First of all, to learn how to take personal responsibility for our part of the conflict. Then we're going to take a look at how to go and approach the other person, because it may either determine the success or failure of the conversation. And then we're going to talk about what it means to be forgiven and to be reconciled, and the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. And if we have time, we'll try to save a few minutes for talking about how to deal with difficult people. Not that you have any difficult people in your life, but seems like God has seen fit to bring difficult people into most everyone's life that will challenge us to know how to deal with it. So that's tomorrow.